Welcome to episode 3 of Through the CSI Lens, Behind the Yellow Tape. I'm Christina Brakeman, and I will be your host for episode 3. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I have appreciated everyone's support and your feedback. I think this is exciting, and this has been a great thing for me to share. Some of it therapeutic, some educational, and some entertaining for those of you who are true crime addicts. Hopefully some of what I'm saying is appealing to you. I just wanted to talk a little bit about episode 2 and just something that kind of stuck with me from that episode. You know, when I was speaking about my experience as a 911 operator and, you know, having that very tragic call come into me and, you know, having to extract relevant, important emergency information to that location so that we could provide assistance to that family. I just wanted to point out, and hopefully those of you know this, that we never go into something like that with the expectation that deadly force will have to be used. That would be the last result. Unfortunately, it was just a circumstance that elevated quickly. It was very chaotic. There were multiple people involved. There was a definite delay in communication between the responding officers, dispatch, and myself. And I think all of that contributed to the result. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that even though it was a child and it was sad and unfortunate, you know, more than unfortunate, for whatever reason, this child decided to be impaired, became involved in an altercation with family members. For whatever reason, we won't know, decided to brandish a weapon and threaten family members with it, even to the point of chasing family members with the weapon, which is what ended in the officer-involved shooting. And as the family and the child were exiting the home out of the garage or carport area, officers had made a decision to make entry. And that was information I did not have at the time. So I couldn't even relay that to the family. But it just occurred in a way that the family was exiting out the same door the officers were coming in. And as a result, one of our officers became pinned between the door and a car that was parked there, and that child, that juvenile that had the weapon, turned on the officer who was stuck and came after that officer, making contact with that officer with that weapon, forced officers on scene to react and engage in deadly force, period. You know, that's it. That's what they did. There's no more than that. It's just period. That's it. And none of them, I can assure you, wanted that scenario to play out that way. I surely didn't. And I know for a fact none of those family members did. So it just drives home the fact that it's an unpredictable profession, whether you're a law enforcement officer, you're behind the scenes as a dispatcher or a call taker, or if you're out there as a crime scene investigator. You just never know what you're going to encounter at that scene, and you try your best to be equipped to handle that the best that you can. Because ultimately we want a positive outcome. Unfortunately, it didn't work this time. So yeah, that just wanted to clarify that in case everybody was wondering, because, you know, it's not like we go out there with intentionality, you know, but they do have a job to do, and that is to protect And unfortunately, someone had to lose their life that day. So, but I thought I would move into something new, a different scene. And this one I remember because it was my last day of field training. My last day. Hallelujah. Praise God. Praise be, or whatever you want to say, because I'm telling you what, by the time you've been hired and gone through your whole background process and you have gone through your academy training, however many weeks, months that's going to be, then you're in field training, and that's several months with different people, different field trainers, and the frustration is totally there because, again, you have field trainers doing their job, and they're telling you what to do, and they're telling you how to do it, and they're showing you how to do it, and they have expectations, and you're being critiqued every single day. And you can be with one field trainer who tells you to do it one way, and you go to another field trainer and they have a different way. And you're just like, well, that's not what so-and-so told me. That's not what so-and-so showed me. And it really doesn't matter. It's you're with this trainer and you're going to do it their way. That's it. So hopefully by the time you get through all this training, you can apply the best tools that you learned in that process and apply it to your crime scene processing. That's the goal. But it is frustrating working under somebody in that close proximity in those stressful situations. So to say that I was relieved is an understatement. But I just, I remember that day because it was a Sunday and it was a day shift. So typically Sundays were slow, Sunday mornings were slow, and it was a nice break, especially because we're typically very busy, right? Because we don't have enough staffing and the city is big and the city's dealing with lots of crime. So, I just remember, okay, I get a few moments to myself today, kind of have some downtime, catch up on paperwork, catch up with my coworkers, maybe grab a coffee, I don't just log right in and jump right into calls for service, which is what typically it is like. So I was looking forward to this day, especially, like I said, after months of field training. And I just woke up, with like a strange mix of relief, definite exhaustion, and excitement because I'm on my own after this. I just got to get through 10 more hours. So again, looking forward to my last day of training. Rotating shifts was taking a toll because it was relatively new to me. Lost lots of sleep. I had no good sleep cycle or sleep patterns at all. And my body was just like rebelling. So I wasn't eating really. I wasn't sleeping really because a lot of times when you're working, you don't have time to eat, let alone use the bathroom. So all of that's been kind of discombobulated, I guess, and I haven't quite established a procedure for that on how to ensure that I'm taking care of myself on duty because guarantee you nobody else is. But that comes with time and experience and you figure out what works for you. And I was a big advocate of that on my squad, is looking out for my people, looking out for the people I worked with, making sure they were eating, making sure they took a break, making sure they went to the bathroom, making sure they had water, that was a big thing for me. So, so on this day, I'm just telling myself it's my last day. It's going to be a good day. And I felt confident with what I had learned and all the training I had, and I was ready. So my normal field trainer, she was actually off that day. She took a vacation day. And I was actually with a supervisor who agreed to step in for that day so that I could get my last day finished. Because you can't just ride with anybody. It has to be a field trainer or a supervisor. So I wasn't really worried about him. I got along with him, although he wasn't very popular in our unit. I didn't care. Him and I had a good rapport, and it seemed like we had a good amount of respect for one another. And I assumed he just kind of let me handle things on my own because, like I said, it was my last day. So it's Sunday morning. I remember the sun was just starting to come up. Back then, people still had newspapers tossed into their driveways. So people were getting, had their newspapers delivered. The neighbors in the neighborhood were starting to step outside, headed to church or wrapping up their weekend routine. It was cooler. It was in the cooler months, which was a welcome change because we had just had an unbearable summer with that heat. And so the air in the morning was kind of cool and brisk, and it was a welcome change from that heat. And that Sunday, the day just started pretty calm. Nothing major coming on, nothing from graveyard shifts to take over. And then dispatch sent me a death investigation. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous, because I still was. I was still new, and you're never going to see everything. You're never going to hear everything. It's just, you just hope that your training, you can lean on it and work your scene efficiently and be proficient in your skill set while you're there. So death scenes are something you never really get used to. The uncertainty of what you're going to see or hear, for me, it's all about the audible things, or smell always stirs a bit of anxiety. And again, as you're driving out there to your scene, you really don't know what you're going to come across or be exposed to, or what you're going to be required to do. So my supervisor and I went over like the call comments, and basically what that consists of is the call taker or 911 operator puts in comments that they're able to, or information that they're able to extract from their caller, their victim or witness or whomever's calling 911. And then at that process, they generate a call for service. It goes over to dispatch, whether it be fire or police or both, and then they send out the necessary, response. So we together had reviewed the comments. We knew it was a dead body. We knew it was in a nice part of town that wasn't keen to this type of activity, at least not on this type of display. So we kind of had a little conversation about that and how we could maybe make the scene more discreet, because we knew that residents were going to start coming out and traveling, leaving their homes, that type of thing. So we kind of were trying to figure that out as we responded out to that death scene. He told me that, I could take the lead, and we would just go from there. So when we pulled into the neighborhood, I just remember I was struck by how normal it was. It was quiet, well-kept lawns, tidy-looking homes, definitely not a type of place where you'd expect to find a dead body. But there, lying along the curb outside somebody's house was exactly that. I saw two of our most experienced homicide detectives who were already on scene, and they had obviously been called out because it was Sunday morning and they don't typically work weekends. They had explained to me that a resident had found the body and called it in. No one had recognized the woman at the time, and there's been nothing suspicious reported. So all we have is this body dump in a residential neighborhood on a Sunday morning. All atypical. So, and this is back in 2007. So this was long before doorbell cameras, widespread use of home surveillance. So there were no recordings to help piece anything together. The woman had no identification. She had no visible injuries, at least that I could tell. And at that point in the investigation, she was listed as a Jane Doe. She was nude, so she had no clothing on. She had no form of ID or any personal effects with her. She was lying on her back. I didn't touch her at this time because that is the responsibility of the death investigator who comes out from the medical examiner's office. But I carefully observed her position and the condition of her body, those type of things. One detail did stand out to me, and it was a very faint, maybe 3-inch long mark across her upper shoulder, chest area. It resembled a tire tread, and I wasn't sure if it came from being dumped or from a vehicle actually running her over or something else entirely. I pointed it out to my homicide detectives, and while they agreed it looked like a tire pattern, none of us were quite certain. I went ahead about my business, photographed the scene. There really wasn't much to do other than photography. Photographing the scene, showing where she was located, the condition of the body in its current position, until the death investigator got on scene and was able to manipulate the body, and then I could take additional photos. When I asked my supervisor, because the more I looked at it, the more I thought that looked like a tire track. So I went back to my supervisor and I said, hey, should I take advanced photographs of this mark on her body? Because according to our policy, whenever possible, pattern evidence, when pattern evidence is found, we are required to take more advanced photography. And that photography allows someone to compare that pattern to a later pattern, like a tire, an actual tire or an actual shoe. But it's in our policies that we shall photograph it using advanced photography. So that does require more equipment, requires a tripod, it requires, a manual setting. And so there is more work to it. And again, it's in policy saying that if we see something like that, especially on a homicide or a death investigation, we should be doing those photos. But, speaking with my supervisor who was there for me the last day, he told me he didn't think it was necessary and that we had covered our basis. That was kind of the end of that conversation, as far as documenting anything further. So against my better judgment, I followed his direction, and soon after, while I was still there, I noticed there was kind of a heated argument that broke out between detectives and the death investigator. And I've never seen this before. Everybody's always been super professional and worked together well, but they were definitely in a disagreement, and it was apparent to everybody on scene. So the detectives believed the woman, who they had now identified through a tattoo, because they searched our database to see if anybody had been arrested or made contact with the police based off this tattoo, and they were able to ID her based off the tattoo. So we moved from a Jane Doe to a person's name. So now we can put a name behind the deceased person there. But they believed that she was a prostitute. There was no believing, that was factual. So she was a prostitute, and she did have an extensive drug history. And they assumed, based off their information and their experience, that she had overdosed at some point and had been dumped, and that this was not a homicide. However, the death investigator arrived on scene, did a preliminary investigation, and he disagreed, insisting it should be considered a homicide, and that's how he was going to rule it until the autopsy came out. So that's where the argument ensued, because homicide wanted to rule it an overdose and a body dump, and the medical death investigator wanted to rule it as a homicide, or at least a suspicious death. So I learned a little bit of something that day, is really first lean on my training and education and experience, but also lean on the insight that a professional, that an expert in death investigation brings to your crime scenes, and that would be the death investigator. So noted that as I move forward with this scene. Interestingly enough, we as a crime scene unit at this time were not responding to homicides, and we're not responding to officer-involved shootings. Our latent print unit, so the forensic scientists that actually examine and analyze fingerprints, they were tasked with that responsibility. So technically, I shouldn't have been at that death scene. A latent print examiner should have been at that death scene. But because we didn't know it was a homicide, and homicide refused to rule it as a homicide at the time, I continued down the path of processing this death scene. So in hindsight, they should have had the latent print examiners out there and had them process the scene. So anyway, that changed a couple of years after that, and we ended up doing both scenes. But at the time, I was not supposed to be there, but there I was in all my glory, trying to do my job on my last day of field training. So, so a latent print examiner, they are highly trained forensic scientists, and they're tasked with examining fingerprints from crime scenes. So, their expertise helps identify and exonerate someone from a crime scene. And again, in hindsight, I shouldn't have processed that scene at all, but I'd already responded, documented, and cleared my scene at this time. So back at the office, I'm doing my thing. I'm downloading my photos. I'm writing my report, finishing what I have done. Days later, I get called up to the latent print office, and a latent print examiner asked me, or called me and told me, and called me, told me to come up to their office because they wanted to discuss the case with me. So I was like, okay. Didn't know what they were going to be asking me, but I was like, it's never a good sign when somebody's beckoning you. So they asked why I hadn't taken advanced photos of that tire mark on the victim, and I admitted I had deferred to my supervisor for advice, and he's recommended not doing them and said it wasn't necessary. So obviously you can imagine my turmoil. I mean, I don't want to throw my supervisor under the bus, but also I did my due diligence on my part, right? So I was really upset. So emotionally upset. I was kind of tearful because I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? Have I prevented us in solving this case? Is because I didn't do what I was required to do by policy, is this going to negatively impact this case being solved? And, I was just literally, I remember sitting there crying, and I was just devastated because I couldn't believe that I had done this, And for me, it was a big deal, especially because I'm new and I'm literally still in field training. So I had no idea what the repercussions were going to be at that time. So, they were not very happy with me. They weren't mean or rude, but I knew that they were frustrated. So, they ended up having to go down to the medical examiner's office and attempt photographs of that tire mark on her body. But by then the pattern had degraded from just condensation and decomposition. So again, I have created an issue for this case. So interestingly, during the autopsy, additional evidence emerged, and evidence that would take us down the homicide route. They observed and located ligature marks on the victim's neck, wrist, and ankles. Now, these details were not visible at the scene, and I wasn't really sure at the time why, but through my process of experience and just talking to people from the medical examiner's office and my training, a lot of factors go into that. They were definitely not visible at the crime scene, 100%. And you can't even see them in my photos. Another reason why you take photos is to document the condition, right? So some of the things that could have prevented the ligature marks from being observed at the crime scene is that just environmental factors or the position of the body. Or maybe if she had been wearing clothes, right? It would have hidden those ligature marks. When you're taking the body down to a medical examiner's office, they do a full examination of the body. They remove any clothing, they have better lighting and light sources that they can examine the body, so more things can be visible at that time. Also, you have to look at the process of decomposition. So as the body starts to break down, these ligature marks become more noticeable, or they enhance the visibility of any of those ligature marks. Also, another thing is that her skin was super pale, and that can also hide early, injuries or any indication of injuries. So all these things kind of went into consideration. And then when you start further talking about decomp, you're talking about livor mortis, which is LIVOR mortis, which is basically postmortem pooling of blood. And that just happens naturally through the death process. But basically, the flow of blood just allows areas of the skin to darken. And as a result, can make those ligature marks stand out more. So that's another thing to consider, that she wasn't decomposing when she was dumped. It looked like it was relatively recent, within 12 hours. And so that could be another indication as to why ligature marks or other injuries weren't noted on her. And then plus, when you're talking about an autopsy, they're also doing internal examination of the body. So that's where they can see actual bruising of, neck muscles or wrist muscles or ankles. So it just becomes more prevalent during the autopsy process and with decomposition of the body, that happens naturally when you die. So that answered that question for me a little bit, just learning the different aspects of how a body decomposes and what that may look like. So that was helpful for me because, originally I was like, oh my gosh, how did I not see ligature marks on her neck and her wrists and her ankles? Well, the reality is that it just hadn't been long enough for those injuries to form. So But I did, take that away from the next time I handled future incidents like that. The interesting thing about this case is that, and I keep saying interesting because it's always interesting to me, is that this victim, this woman, she had been married and they had children, and her husband had died. And as a result, she came into a lump sum of money, which was pretty considerable and really changed the quality of her life. And in the process, because she had this home that she was caring for and kids, she couldn't maintain the house, or didn't know how to. So she actually hired people to help her. And in the process, she became friends with people that, were engaged in criminal activity, including drugs. And that's where she was exposed to drugs. And so she hired these people to help her around her home. They got her addicted to drugs, or she made a decision to do the drugs, whatever case it may be. And in the process, she began, selling herself, and then she lost her home, and then she lost custody of her kids. So it's just a really sad story that, I didn't think, because I didn't have the experience enough to think that she was just a prostitute who overdosed and got dumped. I just thought from the beginning, this is a person, this is a human, and this isn't normal. And we need to investigate this case like it's not normal. You don't want to bring in your preconceived notions or experiences, because that can taint your investigation, which is exactly the direction it was going. Thank goodness we had qualified medical death investigators to help determine her cause of death. And although the tire track was there, that really wasn't going to be what identified her suspect. She actually ended up being a victim of a serial rapist and murderer that we had going on, who was targeting prostitutes. So she was a victim of one of the serial killers that we had in the valley. And as a result of DNA, actually, he was identified and convicted of the murder and rape of this victim. So kind of went full circle on that, and how, eventually she wasn't, she may have been a prostitute and she may have been a drug addict, but she's still human. She's still a person. She's still a mom. She's still a sister. She's still a wife. She's still a daughter. And, she deserves the best kind of care and service that we could provide. So, learning lesson for me is not to deviate from policy and procedure, and to just do it, because you can't go back, right? Fortunate the late print examiner was able to go down there and complete photographs, but still, it really impacted the integrity of that pattern evidence. So glad I learned that early on. Don't want to be in that position again. But so that case just kind of stayed with me. And the fact that it was tied to a serial killer was kind of a big deal, wow, I just worked this scene. There was a serial killer involved. He was killing multiple women. And my work, forensic scientist work, all came together in the autopsy to identify her suspect. So at the end, it worked out great. Obviously, the best outcome we could ask for. Not only did we put a stop to him, but we were able to solve more than one crime, actually. So that was good. And her family then could get some kind of closure. And that's what we want to do, right? So we're serving our community, and we want to meet that need as best as we can. One of the things that I was able to do after this call, it was a couple of years, but I took a training course, actually, and it was specifically over footwear and tire track evidence, and how to effectively retrieve it or recover it at crime scenes. So it was through Ron Smith and Associates, Inc. And if you're interested in any type of training, or if you get hired on in the future, this is a company that you definitely want to seek out and take additional training for or with. So yeah, the course was really good. It really emphasized on the practice of a wide variety of techniques, so that I could be proficient in recovering footwear and tire track evidence, and be knowledgeable and have the application of techniques and skills that I would need for my crime scenes. Really helped me learn how to evaluate impressions at my crime scene. So like shoe impressions that might be in dirt or snow or mud. And just the general knowledge of manufacturing characteristics of these shoes and tires, and how they result in the wearing of shoes and tires, and how that microscopic detail can help identify or exonerate a source. So it was about a 24-hour course. I really liked it. I went up to Tacoma. It was in March, so it was cold or cooler. Some snow on the ground, which gave us some good practicing with snow, because down here in Arizona in the valley, not really working with snow. If you're in northern Arizona, maybe, but not so much here. So I got to learn how they actually document and preserve shoe prints and tire tracks in snow. That was kind of interesting. They're using basically like a harden or a spray paint that can actually harden and mold and put over the snow and the impression to be able to capture that image. So I thought that was pretty cool. Definitely walked away with a better understanding and was able to document my crime scenes in the future more articulately, and preserving any type of trace evidence that might be attached to those impressions, or just the basic knowledge of capturing the images through photography and advanced photography. It did come into play eventually because early on somebody's home was broken into, so that's a residential burglary. They jumped over the stucco wall, and when they jumped down, they left these perfect shoe impressions in mud and dirt. I mean, they couldn't have been more perfect. 2 perfect impressions that I'm telling you, you never get those, at least not out here. But then they broke into the window, and what they did was steal a bunch of items from the house, and then they filled the victim's car, or one of the victim's car, with all the stolen items and stole the car. So not only did they break into the home and steal some of their possessions, they stole their car as well. So I felt horrible for the victim, But knowing that through my observations, I had seen these perfect shoe prints, and having been to training, I'm like, I'm going to cast those impressions. I'm going to lift them, and I'm going to submit them to the lab. So if we ever find out who did this, or we get an investigative lead, we are going to collect all their shoes, and they can do a comparison. Well, not too many people in my unit has ever done that. And so I was kind of teased for doing the work, for casting those shoe impressions. It was a long process. That day I was out at that scene for several hours because the ground was cold and that dental stone took forever to set. So basically that's what we're using. We're using a casting material to put into those shoe impressions and cast the pattern, the shoe pattern. And it took hours. But I finally got it and decided I would never do it again on a property crime. But obviously I would on a more serious crime like a homicide or something like that. But it's okay. It was a learning lesson. And I was able to retrieve that cast, that mold, and submit it. And funny, that night, an officer pulled over that stolen vehicle and it had 4 occupants in it. And the crime scene investigator who went out to the stolen vehicle recovery said, hey, the CSI took a cast of these shoe impressions at the home. You need to collect all these guys' shoes. And so we collected all of their shoes to see if they were one of the ones that created the shoe impressions at that residential burglary. So, you know, my training came into play. I did a good job at it, kind of redeemed myself a little bit, I guess. But I got teased quite a bit for doing that casting on those shoes. But for me, I was like, I'm going to do it. I don't care. You guys can make fun of me all you want. If it was my home, I'd want the person coming out to be as thorough as possible and retrieve as much evidence as they could. That's what I'm getting paid for. So that's what I'm going to do. I don't care how long I have to be out here. I'm going to sit out here and wait for that mold to form. Again, I'd want somebody to do that for me. So that was a good experience. The training was good. And obviously I took that with me through the rest of my career. This kind of continued education, I can't encourage it enough. Can never know too much. And that's one thing about forensics, is that you're always learning more. So, that was a good time. And when I talk about, the homicide case and how it was solved, not necessarily by the tire impression. And when I think about that tire, like mark on her, I don't think she was run over. I mean, I didn't read the autopsy. I don't have access to that. But what I think what happened probably, or more likely happened, is that she was put in the trunk of a vehicle and there was a tire exposed, maybe a spare tire exposed, and her body came up against it. And through that process, the pattern of the tire just impressed on her skin, that black. If you ever touched a tire, your hands get black. So it's kind of like her skin, her shoulder, chest area came in contact with that, and it transferred to her body and left that mark. So that's kind of what I'm assuming happened. I could be wrong, but like I said, I didn't notice any extensive injuries. And based on how the pattern was and where it was placed, it just didn't make sense for nothing else to be injured. No visible injuries. I mean, if you're going to get run over by a car, you're going to see some serious injuries, I would expect. So I think it was more that it was just a pattern transfer that went onto her skin more than her being rolled over, or ran over. So good thing the DNA was able to be, analyzed, and we were able to make the ID on her suspect. But that whole experience definitely stayed with me. And I just, again, always follow my training, my instincts, my procedures, no matter who tells you what. I don't ever know what happened to my supervisor as far as that part was concerned. If he had disciplinary action, got talked to, I don't know. At that point, it's not in my business. There was an entry made in my workstation file, rightfully so, but, I wasn't written up, I guess, more of a verbal type situation. And again, the training definitely helped with that, moving into the future for sure. And definitely gave me practical skills for what I may encounter in the future. So I appreciated that quite a bit. Let's see what else. Oh, I know what I wanted to talk about. More so about... Let's see. I want to talk a little bit about DNA. We'll get to that in a second. But, I reflect back on those cases. And first of all, I was happy to go to Tacoma. It was beautiful. Went to this awesome, I think it was a Ford museum. Beautiful cars there. So if you're a vehicle addict, you like to collect vehicles, it was a beautiful museum. So I was able to have some downtime. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, and those were stunning. And I'm telling you what, the food was fantastic. So I just had a really good time in Tacoma, even though the weather was kind of cold and snowy, but good experience overall. And, I just reflect back and just think to trust my intuition. And there's a reason why you should follow your policies and procedures and lean into the experts at your scene. Like the death investigator, that's what he does for a living. That's where he's special. That's a specialty. So really lean into what he has to advise and learn from that. It definitely made me a better crime scene investigator because, again, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that person that's missing clues at the crime scenes or just not processing their crime scenes thoroughly. Just didn't want to have to even testify to why I missed something or didn't do something. So again, great learning experience for me starting out, and definitely took that with me in the future, into my future crime scenes. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to talk about is I posted on my Instagram, basically ask a CSI. Ask me any questions you have about crime scene work and forensics, and I will try to answer that. So I had one of my friends post a comment about DNA and how do we process DNA, or how do we go through all the DNA samples? Like, what does that look like? So I'm just going to give you a layman's version of the DNA process without getting too technical. You can always go and do your own research, or if you want to reach out to me or send me an email, you can do that, and I can get more technical, more scientific with you. So typically this responsibility or this discipline will be the serology, DNA biology department. And it will be a forensic scientist who has specialized training and education in a hard science, mostly chemistry, those type of classes. So But when it comes to like DNA in a crime lab, it's not as simple as going to your crime scene or swabbing a sample and instantly knowing who did it. I mean, there's a very careful, like step-by-step process that we do behind the scenes. So if I'm a CSI and I'm looking for biological evidence, so it could be blood, could be saliva, could be vaginal fluids, could be semen, anything that is biological in nature. Even if I don't know that that is, but I presume it is based on the crime scene and what the evidence is telling me and based on my experience and my education, I'm going to collect anything that looks like blood or saliva, or even just if you touch DNA, skin cells that may have been left behind. So even touch DNA. So when you touch something, you leave skin cells behind, and we call that touch DNA. We can still get a profile on that, even with a small sample. So clearly I'm going to be processing that in the crime scene, collecting it, following my policies and procedures. I'm going to package it appropriately so that it's not contaminated. Most of those DNA samples have to be dried. We can't submit them wet because they could grow mold and then it could contaminate the sample. So I have to ensure that my sample that I've collected from my crime scene is dry before I package it and submit it to our evidence section. And again, all of this maintains a chain of custody so everybody knows who collected it, where it was collected, what day, what time. They know how I collected it based off my report and based off our policies and procedures. So all of that is already in play. Once it gets to the lab, it's going to be the forensic scientist's job to pull the DNA out of the cells and kind of clean it up, so that it can be analyzed. We want to get rid of all the contaminants in that sample. It could be any type of contaminant in that sample, but we want to get rid of that so that we get a good sample for analysis. So after that, they'll figure out how much DNA is actually present in the sample and determine, is it good enough shape? Is it quality enough to be tested further? Once they make that determination, something to keep in mind is that when I'm out at my crime scenes and I'm collecting DNA, usually my samples are pretty small. Quantitatively, it's very small. So because of that, forensic scientists will use a technique called PCR. So basically what this does is it's just a copy machine for DNA. So imagine when you put a piece of paper, a document that you want copied on your copy machine. The DNA is the same thing. This PCR basically copies that DNA sample. That way we have enough to work with. We're not actually contaminating the original sample. We're actually working from a copy. And also preserves the original sample in case the prosecution wants to hire their own expert to do DNA analysis. So then now we're at this point, the DNA gets run through a machine, and that machine or that instrumentation's purpose is to separate it into patterns, kind of like a barcode. And then those patterns are what we call a DNA profile. So now we've got a DNA profile, hopefully, from the sample. We have that little barcode, and it's saying, okay, this is your profile of the DNA. Once we are to this point, that profile can then be compared to a suspect's DNA. So suppose that we bring in somebody for questioning and we have a search warrant on them that we can collect hair samples, fingernail scrapings, and DNA sample from them. So now we can actually compare it to that sample, or we can run it through the CODIS database, which is basically a large database, DNA database that is maintained by the FBI. And so this database has DNA samples from convicted felons, people that have an occupation or a job that required them to donate their DNA, like myself. And those DNA samples are maintained in that database, and it's only for law enforcement purposes. So CODIS is a valuable database for the forensic scientist that does DNA analysis. And CODIS is spelled CODIS. At this point, if there's a match, the forensic scientist will also calculate the odds of that DNA belonging to someone else. So we speak in probabilities. What is the probability that it could be anybody else but this person? And you'll hear that in the testimony. Nothing is ever 100% certain, but we have the probability that it could be nobody else. I mean, the likelihood that anybody else could have provided this DNA sample is nearly impossible, scientifically impossible, implausible. It just won't happen. So we're talking numbers like 1 in a trillion. Like, there's just no way it could be anybody else's DNA but this person. So from there, the forensic scientist's work has to be checked and has to be ensured that the second forensic scientist receives the same results. If they don't, then there's a problem. Is it the problem with the instrumentation and the analysis that was done? Is there a problem with the policies and procedures the forensic scientist did? So, but as long as they both agree and come out with the same results, then the forensic scientist can issue a report and then can testify in court and explain, what the DNA shows, and also, just importantly, what it doesn't show, who it excludes, what percentage of the population does it exclude. And again, one thing I like to tell people is that DNA doesn't prove guilt all by itself, right? It's just one piece of the evidence. It's the totality of the evidence that is collected at the crime scene that work together, that either identify someone as the source or something as the source or does not. So yes, DNA is very individualistic when you have a known source, but you should not put all of your weight into the DNA results if you're a detective or a crime scene investigator. That's why when I go out to crime scenes, I'm looking for more than just DNA. Am I thrilled when I think I can get some good DNA? Absolutely. But I'm also looking for fingerprints. I'm also looking for shoe and tire. I'm also looking for video. I'm looking for tool marks. I'm looking for clothing. I'm looking for items left behind. I'm looking for damage. I'm looking for everything, and I want to collect everything so that the forensic scientist has all these possibilities to choose from when deciding what's going to be analyzed and what isn't. And that decision is also made with the help of the detective. They're always going to pick the most probative thing for analysis. We're not processing every single thing. We're going to go with what we think is going to give us the most value, which is typically fingerprints and DNA, and then we're going to move down the line from there. So we don't have an unlimited budget, and that costs time, that costs money and time. So again, is it valuable? Yes, but it should not be the only thing that you put your weight in when you're doing your crime scene investigation, or if you're a detective or police officer or even forensic scientist. So I thought I would share that with you a little bit. If you have more questions on that, you can email me or just reach out to me personally. And I have that that thread or post pinned at the top of my Instagram at through the, it's actually through_the_CSI_lens, and you can just ask questions there, or you can email me at throughthecsilens@gmail.com, and I will answer you as well. So thank you, Kathy, for that information. On my next podcast, we will probably talk about another scene that I had a few years on, but it was kind of personal in nature. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of detail as far as the personal nature, but I want you to take away from it, that there was a death involved, but also for those of you who are looking to go into this profession, some of the obstacles you're going to face in the field and how you can navigate around those, and what I did in this circumstance to navigate the challenges I faced, the technical challenges I faced at my scene. So it's not so much the actual scene itself as it is with some of the challenges that I had to work through while I was on scene. So that'll be the next podcast. But thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. If you like this episode, I'd love it if you would subscribe, so that way you're notified when my next episode uploads. Leave a review if you can. It helps others find the show. And again, follow me on Instagram. I do like to post photos and kind of training type things on the Instagram feed. And then also, if you have any questions, again, post your question or send me an email. And don't forget to share with your family and friends. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you next time.